Welcome to London Gritty Chronicles. Imagine a city without a lock on its door. For thousands of years, this was the reality of urban life. Cities had high stone walls to stop armies, but they had no defense against an invisible invader. They had no paperwork to track travelers. They had no hospitals for the infected. They had no concept of risk management. Today, we are going to explore how humanity learned to control chaos. We will look at the history of the bureaucracy that keeps us safe. We will see how the fear of death created the first passports, the first health inspections, and the very first government agencies. Along the way, we will master the English vocabulary of procedure. These are the words you need to understand rules, regulations, and official systems. Words like compliance, restriction, authorize, and protocol. This is the story of how cities woke up. October 1347. The port of Messina, Sicily. The morning sun hits the water. It looks like a normal day for trade. The harbor is busy. You can hear the shouting of sailors and the creaking of wood. 12 galleys, large trading ships, row into the harbor. They come from the Black Sea. The dock workers prepare to unload the cargo. In historical English, cargo refers to the goods carried by a ship, plane, or truck. These ships are carrying silk, spices, and grain. But they are also carrying something else. When the local workers board the ships, they witness a nightmare. Most of the sailors are dead. Those who are still alive are covered in black boils that ooze blood and pus. The smell is unbearable. The people of Messina do not know what a bacterium is. They do not know what a flea is. They only see death. Panic spreads instantly. The harbor master orders the ships to leave. But it is too late. The rats have already scurried down the ropes. The fleas have already jumped onto the dock workers. The biological bomb has detonated. This moment in history teaches us our first lesson in procedural English: the difference between prevention and reaction. Prevention means stopping a problem before it happens. Reaction means acting after the problem has already occurred. Messina reacted. They pushed the ships away. But because they had no system for prevention, no inspections, no waiting period, the city was doomed. Within days, the infection moved from the port to the market, from the market to the homes, from the homes to the churches. This was the beginning of the Black Death. To understand why this was so devastating, we must look at the medieval mindset. In the mid-14th century, risk was not calculated, it was endured. If a disaster happened, people believed it was the will of God. It was a punishment for sin. There was no central authority responsible for public health. There were no officials checking papers. Listen to that word, authority. In a general sense, authority is the power to give orders. In an institutional sense, the authorities, plural, refers to the police, the government, or the people in charge. In 1347, the authorities were the local nobles and the church. They had power over taxes and war, but they had no power over biology. They had no protocol. A protocol is a set of official rules or procedures for doing something. When you go to a hospital today, the doctors follow a strict protocol. They wash their hands. They wear masks. In 1347, there was no protocol. As the plague swept north through Italy, into France, and eventually to England, cities began to realize that prayer and running away were not working. The old world was collapsing. Historians estimate that between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed perhaps 30% to 60% of Europe's population. It is difficult to verify the exact numbers, but the scale is undeniable. Imagine your own city. Now imagine half the people are gone. The shops are empty. The government has collapsed because the scribes and the guards are dead. This total breakdown forced survivors to think differently. They stopped looking only at the sky for answers. They started looking at the ships. They started looking at the roads. They realized that the disease traveled. It moved with people. It moved with goods. And if it moved, maybe it could be stopped. Or at least slowed down. This realization that movement carries risk is the foundation of modern civilization. It is the reason you need a passport today. It is the reason restaurants have health inspections. But before they could build a system, they had to survive the chaos. Let's go to Venice, the superpower of the Mediterranean. Venice was a city built on water, entirely dependent on trade. If ships stopped coming, Venice died. If ships kept coming, Venice died. This was the terrible dilemma. The Doge of Venice, the leader of the city, faced this dilemma. He needed a way to keep the trade flowing, but stop the death. He needed a filter. At first, the attempts were crude. Armed guards were placed at the entrance to the Grand Canal. They were given simple orders. Do not let the sick enter. But this brings us to a key problem in risk management: detection. To detect means to discover or notice something that is hidden. The plague has an incubation period. A sailor can look healthy today, but be deadly tomorrow. The guards at the canal could see the black boils, but they could not see the invisible infection inside a healthy-looking man. The visual inspection failed. Venice, like Messina, began to bury its dead in mass graves. But in the tragedy, a new vocabulary of control was emerging. Cities started to appoint specific men to handle the crisis. These were not priests, they were administrators. They were given a specific task: to monitor the situation. To monitor means to watch and check something over a period of time. They monitored the death tolls. They monitored which houses were infected. For the first time, the government was trying to collect data on the health of its citizens. This was a radical shift. Before this, a king might count his people to tax them. Now, the city needed to count its people to save them. The relationship between the citizen and the state changed. The state began to say, "We have the right to know your health status. We have the right to enter your home. We have the right to stop you from traveling." This is the birth of the regulatory state. Regulatory comes from the word regulate, which means to control something by means of rules. As the first wave of the Black Death subsided in the early 1350s, the survivors looked at the wreckage. They knew the plague would return. It was not a one-time event. It was a recurring nightmare. They needed a permanent solution. They needed a system that did not depend on luck. Far across the Adriatic Sea, in a city called Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, a group of merchants was discussing a revolutionary idea. They were not doctors. They were practical men. They understood time. They asked a simple question: what if we don't ban the ships? What if we just make them wait? This idea seems simple to us now, but in the 14th century it was a stroke of genius. It was the invention of the waiting period. In English, we often use the word mandatory. Mandatory means required by law or rules. Compulsory. Ragusa was about to introduce a mandatory waiting period for all incoming travelers. It was a cold, calculated administrative decision. It was not about compassion. It was about risk assessment. But how long should they wait? And where would they stay? You cannot leave a ship floating in the ocean forever during a storm. The City Council of Ragusa sat down to write a document that would change the history of travel. They dipped their quills in ink. They drafted a new law. The law stated that anyone arriving from a plague-infested area could not enter the city immediately. They had to go to a nearby island. They had to stay there for 30 days. 30 days. In Italian, trenta. This was the Trentino. It was the first time a government used isolation as a standard policy for healthy people, just in case. Isolation means the state of being separate from others. The experiment in Ragusa was about to begin. If it worked, it would save the city. If it failed, the rats would win again. But the merchants of Ragusa had made one mistake. 30 days wasn't quite long enough, and the accommodations on the rocky islands were brutal. As the ships dropped anchor off the coast of Ragusa, the sailors looked at the barren rocks where they were forced to wait. They were hungry, they were exposed to the wind, and they were angry. This brings us to the friction between policy and human nature. A policy is a course of action adopted by a government or organization. The policy was sound, keep the risk away. But the reality was messy. People tried to sneak ashore. People tried to bribe the guards. The black market for food exploded. We see here the eternal conflict of public health, safety versus liberty. But Ragusa held firm. They refined their system. They realized 30 days might be too short. They looked at the Bible, or perhaps Greek medical texts. Historians debate the exact inspiration. And they found a number with more weight, a number that sounded complete. 40. 40 days. In Italian, quaranta. The word was about to be born, a word that everyone in the modern world knows, a word that carries the weight of boredom, fear, and safety. Quarantine. But establishing the rule was the easy part. Enforcing it required a new kind of army, not of soldiers, but of bureaucrats. Men with clipboards, stamps, and the power to say no. How did the rest of Europe react to this innovation? Did they copy it immediately, or did they ignore it? And what happened when the disease wasn't coming from a ship, but from the house next door? The walls of the city were no longer enough. The danger was now inside the gates. The number 40 is not just a number in history. It is a psychological border. It is the line between sick and safe. We left Ragusa with its 30-day waiting period, but soon the mighty city of Venice looked at this experiment, saw the potential, and decided to make it stricter. They added 10 days. Why 40? Historians debate the exact reason. Some say it was based on Greek medical theories about how long it takes for a fever to break. Others point to the Bible. The Great Flood lasted 40 days. Jesus fasted for 40 days. In the medieval mind, 40 days represented a cycle of purification. Venice took this number and built a wall of time. They called it the quarantena. But a rule is useless without a place to enforce it. You cannot just tell a ship captain to wait somewhere. You need a specific location. In 1423, Venice established the first permanent hospital for plague victims and travelers on a lonely island in the lagoon. They called it the Lazzaretto. This brings us to a crucial English word, facility. A facility is a place, amenity, or piece of equipment provided for a particular purpose. Imagine arriving at the Lazzaretto in the 15th century. Your ship is guided away from the sparkling palaces of St. Mark's Square. You are towed to a quiet, flat island. The air smells of vinegar and burning rosemary, early attempts at disinfection. You step off the boat. You are not free. You are a suspect. In legal and procedural English, pay attention to the stress in this word. As a noun or adjective, the stress is on the first syllable. Suspect. These are suspect goods. Goods that might be dangerous. He is a suspect. A person thought to be guilty or infected. But as a verb, the stress is on the second syllable. Suspect. I suspect he is lying. The Venetian officials treated every arriving sailor as a suspect, noun. They did not care if you felt healthy. They cared about the timeline. To manage this, the city had to implement strict measures. To implement means to put a decision or plan into effect. A measure is a specific action taken to achieve a particular result. Venice implemented a measure requiring all wool, silk, and cloth to be aired out in the sun. They believed the seeds of the disease hid in the fabric. Picture the scene on the island. Hundreds of bales of expensive silk are unrolled on the ground. Men with long poles turn the cloth over, terrified to touch it with their hands. They are following the protocol. If you were a merchant, this was a nightmare. Your goods were sitting in the sun, fading, losing value. You were losing money every day you sat on that island. This created a massive incentive to cheat. Merchants tried to hide their best cloth. They tried to bribe the island guards. So, the government had to tighten its grip. They needed to ensure compliance. Compliance means the action or fact of complying with a wish or command. The merchant was in compliance with the rules. The ship was out of compliance. If you were not in compliance, your goods were burned. This system in Venice, the Lazzaretto, the 40-day wait, the inspections, became the gold standard. Other cities watched and learned. They saw that Venice was surviving while others were collapsing. But there was a problem. The Lazzaretto only protected the sea. It was a shield against ships. What happens when the enemy approaches by land? In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the plague continued to flare up across Europe. It moved along the roads, carried by soldiers, pilgrims, and peddlers. A city wall could stop an army, but it couldn't stop a man with a fake health pass. Or could it? As the threat moved from the port to the city gates, governments realized they needed a permanent organization to manage the risk. It wasn't enough to react when a ship arrived. They needed constant vigilance. They invented the health board. In Italian, the Magistrato alla Sanità. This was a revolutionary concept. Before this, health was a matter for doctors or priests. Now, it was a matter for the police and the bureaucrats. The Health Board was a committee of powerful nobles given extraordinary legal powers. They could bypass the normal courts. If they thought your house was infected, they could board it up with you inside. No trial, no jury, just the order of the board. This teaches us a phrase often used in history and politics: emergency powers. Emergency powers are special rights granted to the government during a crisis, allowing them to bypass normal laws. The Health Board began to create a paper trail. They started writing things down. They created the precursors to the modern passport. They called them health vedi, or bills of health. Imagine a merchant trying to walk from Milan to Venice in 1485. He arrives at the city gate. The guard lowers his pike. "Papers," the guard demands. The merchant produces a small, crumpled piece of paper. It is signed by the Health Board of Milan. It certifies that Milan is free of plague. If he has the paper, he enters. If he does not, he is turned away, or worse, thrown into a land-based quarantine. This tiny piece of paper changed the world. It shifted the right to travel from a natural physical to a granted privilege. But as these health boards grew stronger, they started to demand more than just papers from travelers. They started to look inside their own cities. They started to look at the poor. They started to look at the dirt. They asked a dangerous question. Who is responsible for the filth in the streets? This question would lead to the first sanitary inspections. It would lead to men walking into private homes to count the beds and smell the air. The private home was no longer a fortress. The state was coming inside. But how did the common people react to these intrusions? When the health board came knocking, did the people open the door? Or did they hide the sick in the attic? The battle for control was about to move from the city walls to the bedroom. The year is 1576, Milan. The plague has returned, as it always does. But this time, the city is ready. Or at least, the bureaucracy is ready. The city gates are locked. The walls are manned. But the real battle is happening inside the city, on the narrow cobblestone streets. A man in a dark robe walks down the street. He is not a doctor. He is a notary, a bureaucrat. He holds a leather-bound book and a quill. He stops at a house and bangs on the door. "Open in the name of the Health Board!" This is the moment the state entered the living room. Before the 16th century, your home was your castle. What happened inside was your business. But the health boards changed the definition of privacy. They argued that a sick person inside a private home was a public weapon. Therefore, the state had the right to inspect. To inspect means to look at something closely, typically to assess its condition or discover any shortcomings. An inspection is the act of inspecting. The notary enters the house. He does not ask, "How are you feeling?" He asks, "How many people sleep here? Who has a fever? Who has died recently?" He writes down the names. He writes down the symptoms. He is building a database of the living and the dead. This is the birth of surveillance. Surveillance is the close observation of a person or group, especially those under suspicion. The root of the word comes from French, sur, over, and veiller, to watch from above. The health boards of northern Italy divided their cities into smaller units to make surveillance easier. In Milan, they used districts. In London, they used wards. This brings us to a key institutional concept: jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the official power to make legal decisions and judgments. It also refers to the specific territory where that power applies. "This street is under my jurisdiction." "That district is outside our jurisdiction." The city was chopped into pieces. Each piece had a captain or an overseer. This captain was responsible for every soul in his jurisdiction. If a person got sick and the captain did not report it, the captain was punished. Suddenly, everyone was watching everyone. But why was this information so valuable? Why did they need to write it down? Because the health boards were trying to track the invisible enemy. They were trying to create a map of the infection. In London, this system evolved into something iconic: the bills of mortality. Imagine a weekly sheet of paper printed on a rough press. It listed every death in the city. It listed the cause. 5 died of fever. 3 died of old age. 40 died of the plague. This was the first time a government systematically collected health statistics. Statistics, plural, are the practice or science of collecting and analyzing numerical data in large quantities. If you were a rich merchant in London or Milan, you would buy this bill of mortality every week. You would read it with shaking hands. You would look at the numbers. If the number of plague deaths was low, you stayed in the city to make money. If the number spiked, you packed your bags and ran to the countryside. This data drove the economy. It drove the fear. But for the poor, there was no running. The health boards introduced a brutal new policy for the infected: strict confinement. Confinement means the action of confining, or keeping someone or something within limits. He was placed in solitary confinement. If the notary found a victim in a poorhouse, the health board would order the house shut up. This is a specific historical phrase: shutting up a house. It meant nailing the doors shut, painting a red cross on the door, posting a guard outside 24 hours a day. No one leaves. No one enters. Imagine the horror. You are healthy, but your brother is sick. The official nails the door shut. You are trapped inside with the dying. You are now a prisoner in your own home. This was a death sentence for the healthy family members inside, but to the health board, it was a necessary sacrifice. It was collateral damage. This tension between saving the city and sacrificing the family created deep resentment. People began to hide their sick. They bribed the searchers. They buried bodies in secret gardens at night to avoid the Red Cross on the door. The system of control created a system of evasion. To evade means to escape or avoid, especially by cleverness or trickery. They tried to evade the taxes. They tried to evade the quarantine. The health boards knew people were evading the rules. So, they increased the penalties. In some cities, breaking quarantine was punishable by death. But the most fascinating part of this history is how these temporary emergency measures became permanent habits of government. The health pass for travelers didn't disappear when the plague faded. It evolved. It became a tool for tracking movement for other reasons: taxes, crime, political control. The inspection of homes didn't disappear. It evolved into building codes, fire safety rules, and census taking. The bill of mortality didn't disappear. It became the modern death certificate and public health data. We are seeing the skeleton of the modern state being built, bone by bone, out of the fear of infection. But the system had a major flaw. It relied on honesty, and in a time of crisis, honesty is the first casualty. As the 17th century approached, the plague was about to strike its most famous blow. A blow that would test every protocol, every rule, and every wall that Europe had built. The Great Plague of London was coming. And the City of London had a unique way of handling it, a system that was both bureaucratic and deeply superstitious. They didn't just have inspectors, they had searchers. Old women, paid by the parish, sent to look at the naked bodies of the dead. Were they reliable? Could you trust a grandmother with no medical training to diagnose the most dangerous disease on Earth? The reliability of the data was about to collapse. London, 1665, the Great Plague. The city is sweltering in the summer heat. The smell of unwashed bodies and rotting garbage is thick in the air. But there is a new smell, the acrid smoke of fires burning in the streets to purify the air. In a dark alleyway, two elderly women walk slowly. They hold white wooden wands in their hands. The wands are a warning. Do not come near us. We have touched the dead. These are the searchers of the dead. In the history of risk management, the searchers are a fascinating and tragic anomaly. They were not doctors. They were not scientists. They were usually poor widows, paid a few pennies by the parish to do the job no one else wanted. Their job was to determine the cause of death. To determine means to officially decide or settle a question. The jury must determine the guilt of the prisoner. The doctor must determine the cause of the illness. When a person died in London, the church bell would toll. The searchers would hear the bell and go to the house. They would strip the body. They would look for the telltale signs, the tokens, the swellings, the black spots. If they saw the tokens, they reported plague. If they saw nothing specific, they might report fever, teeth, or old age. They reported their findings to the parish clerk. The clerk sent the numbers to the hall. The hall printed the weekly bill of mortality. This system sounds organized. It sounds like a proper procedure. A procedure is an established or official way of doing something. But the procedure had a fatal flaw. The searchers were human, and they were poor. Imagine you are a father in 1665. Your child dies. You see the black spot. You know it is the plague. If the searchers report plague, the authorities will come. They will nail your door shut. They will paint the Red Cross. You and your remaining family will be trapped inside to die. This is the protocol. But if the searchers report spotted fever or consumption, you can bury your child quietly. You can leave your house. You can flee the city. So, when the old women arrive with their white wands, you meet them at the door. You hold out a silver coin, a shilling, a bribe. "It was the fever," you whisper. "Just the fever." The women take the coin. They nod. They report fever to the clerk. This act creates corruption. Corruption is dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, typically involving bribery. Because of this corruption, the historical data is inaccurate. Inaccurate means not correct or true. Historians today believe the official death tolls of the Great Plague were massive underestimates. The bills of mortality claimed 68,000 died. The real number was likely over 100,000. The system of record-keeping was broken by the human desire for freedom. This teaches us a critical lesson in institutional English: the difference between policy, what is written, and enforcement, what actually happens. The policy was strict: report every plague death. The enforcement was weak. It relied on underpaid, untrained searchers who could be bought. Despite the corruption, the fear of the searchers was real. They were the agents of the state. When they knocked, the power of the government stood on your doorstep. As the summer of 1665 turned to autumn, the death toll rose so high that the system began to collapse entirely. There were not enough searchers. There were not enough graves. The dead carts rumbled through the streets at night, the drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead!" The ritual of inspection failed because the scale of the disaster was too big. But across the English Channel, in France, the king was watching. Louis XIV, the Sun King, did not believe in messy local solutions like searches. He believed in absolute control. He believed in the power of the army. He looked at the plague as if it were an invading army, and you stop an army with a line of soldiers. This leads us to one of the most significant inventions in the history of travel restrictions, the cordon sanitaire. This is a French term that became standard English vocabulary in diplomacy and health. A cordon is a line or circle of police, soldiers, or guards preventing access to or from an area. Sanitaire means sanitary or health-related. A cordon sanitaire is a sanitary barrier. When the plague erupted in the French city of Marseille in 1720, the last great plague of Europe, the French government did not just hire old women to check bodies. They sent the military. They built a literal wall. The Mur de la Peste, Wall of the Plague. You can still see ruins of it in the hills of Provence today. It was a dry stone wall, manned by soldiers day and night. The orders given to these soldiers were simple and terrifying. They were not there to inspect papers. They were not there to take bribes. Their orders were, if anyone tries to cross this wall, shoot to kill. This was the ultimate restriction. A restriction is a limiting condition or measure, especially a legal one. There are strict travel restrictions in place. The shift from the bribable grandmother in London to the soldier with a musket in France marks a change in how states managed risk. It moved from a civic duty to a military operation. But shooting people is extreme. It is bad for trade. It is bad for politics. Governments needed a middle ground. They needed a way to control movement that was strict but sustainable. They needed a document that was harder to fake than a handwritten note. They needed a standardized system that every country would recognize. They needed to invent the modern passport. But wait, a piece of paper is just paper. To make it work, you need a network of people who trust each other. You need a spy network of consuls and ambassadors. In the 18th century, the Bill of Health evolved. It was no longer just a local receipt. It became a diplomatic weapon. If a ship arrived in London from Smyrna, modern-day Izmir, and the captain did not have a clean bill of health signed by the British consul in Smyrna, the ship was treated as a floating bomb. The captain was not just a sailor anymore. He was a liability. Liability is the state of being responsible for something, especially by law. It also means a person or thing whose presence or behavior is likely to cause embarrassment or put one at a disadvantage. The infected ship is a liability to the port. This created a new global game. Nations started using health restrictions to hurt each other's trade. If the British wanted to slow down French trade, they might rumor that there was plague in Marseille. Suddenly, every port in Europe would ban French ships. Quarantine became a political tool. But as the 19th century arrived, a new enemy appeared. It wasn't the plague. It was something faster, deadlier, and more mysterious. It came from the water, not the rats. It was cholera. And cholera would prove that all the walls, all the soldiers, and all the 40-day waiting periods were completely useless. The old system was about to crash against a new biological reality. The bureaucrats had to rewrite the rulebook again. The year is 1831. A ship docks in Sunderland, England. It carries a new kind of passenger. Not a rat, not a flea, but a microscopic vibrio in the water barrel. Cholera has arrived in Britain. This was the Blue Death. It terrified people more than the plague because of its speed. A man could wake up healthy, have breakfast, and be dead by dinner, his skin turning a ghostly blue from dehydration. The government's first instinct was to do what they had always done: use the protocol of the past. They declared a quarantine. They sent the Navy to blockade the coast. They tried to stop the ships. But this time, the merchants of London and Liverpool screamed in protest. "You are killing the economy!" they shouted. "The ships must flow!" This brings us to a massive conflict in the history of risk management: trade versus health. In the 1830s, a new group of thinkers emerged. They were called the sanitarians. They argued that quarantines were old-fashioned, expensive, and useless against this new disease. They believed the disease was not caused by touch, but by bad air, miasma. They were wrong about the science. It was water, not air. But they were right about the solution. To fix the bad air, they didn't need soldiers. They needed engineers. They needed inspectors. They needed to clean the city. This is the moment the word sanitary enters the core vocabulary of government. Sanitary relates to the conditions that affect hygiene and health, especially the supply of sewage and clean water. The sanitary conditions in the slum were terrible. We need a new sanitary policy. Enter a man named Edwin Chadwick. Chadwick was not a doctor. He was a lawyer, a bureaucrat, a man who loved paperwork more than people. He looked at the problem of disease and saw it as an engineering failure. He wrote a famous report, The Sanitary Condition of the Laboring Population, 1842. It is a dry title, but it is one of the most important documents in English history. It argued that the state had a duty to build sewers. The state had a duty to pick up the garbage. To do this, the government needed a new kind of army. Not the searchers of the dead, not the soldiers at the wall. They invented the Inspector of Nuisances. This is a wonderful, strange job title. In legal English, a nuisance, noun, is an act, condition, or thing that causes inconvenience or annoyance to others, or that is offensive to the senses. The smell from the factory is a public nuisance. The Inspector of Nuisances had the power to enter your backyard. He could look at your overflowing cesspool, toilet pit. He could look at your pile of rotting vegetables. He could point a finger and say, "That is a nuisance. Remove it or we will fine you." This was a radical expansion of government power. The state was no longer just stopping you at the border. It was telling you how to manage your own waste. To manage this, the British government passed the Public Health Act of 1848. This act created the General Board of Health. It was the first time a central government department was created solely to manage the physical health of the nation. Let's look at the vocabulary of this new institution. The Act gave the board the power to enforce regulations. To enforce means to compel observance of a law, rule, or obligation. The police enforced the speed limit. The inspector enforced the sanitary code. It also gave them the power to levy rates, taxes, to pay for sewers. To levy, verb, means to impose a tax, fee, or fine. The city will levy a tax on new buildings. Suddenly, the city was full of men with clipboards measuring drains. They were checking the slope of the pipes. They were checking the flow of the water. This was the birth of infrastructure as a health tool. Infrastructure refers to the basic physical and organizational structures and facilities, for example, buildings, roads, power supplies, needed for the operation of a society. Before 1848, a sewer was a private convenience. After 1848, a sewer was public health infrastructure. But there was a problem. The merchants and the landlords hated Edwin Chadwick. They hated the cost. They hated the interference. They called him a tyrant. "Why should I pay to clean the poor man's drain?" the rich landlord asked. This is the concept of public good. A public good is a commodity or service that is provided without profit to all members of a society. Chadwick argued that health was a public good. If the poor man gets cholera, the rich man dies too. Therefore, the rich man must pay for the poor man's sewer. This argument, that we are all biologically connected, is the foundation of the modern welfare state. But while Chadwick was building sewers to fight bad air, a quiet doctor named John Snow was walking through the streets of Soho, London, in 1854. He was not looking at the air. He was looking at the water. He was conducting an investigation. An investigation is the action of investigating something or someone, formal or systematic examination. John Snow did something revolutionary. He used data to challenge the authorities. He took a map of the outbreak. He marked every death with a black bar. He noticed a pattern. The deaths were clustered around a single water pump, the Broad Street pump. He went to the local authority, the Board of Guardians, and said something that sounded insane to them. "The water is the killer. Remove the handle from the pump." The authorities were skeptical. They believed in miasma, air. They didn't believe in water-borne poison. But the death toll was so high, they agreed to try it. They removed the handle. The cases dropped. The outbreak ended. This moment is legendary. It is the birth of epidemiology. Epidemiology is the branch of medicine which deals with the incidence, distribution, and possible control of diseases. But more importantly for our story of risk management, it changed the focus of the inspection. The inspector of nuisances was no longer just looking for smells. He needed to look for contamination. Contamination is the action or state of making or being made impure by polluting or poisoning. The water supply has suffered contamination. After John Snow, the city began to realize that risk was invisible. You couldn't just smell it. You had to test for it. This required a new level of expertise. The searcher, the old woman, was gone. The inspector of nuisances, the man with the nose, was useful, but not enough. Now, the city needed the analyst, the scientist in the lab. As the 19th century ended, the management of risk moved from the street corner to the laboratory. The passport was still there. The quarantine was still there. But now there was a test tube involved. The age of the microscope had arrived. But just as cities were getting a handle on bacteria, the world was getting smaller. Steamships were crossing oceans in weeks, not months. Trains were crossing continents in days. How could the slow-moving bureaucracy keep up with the fast-moving train? They needed to standardize the rules. They needed the nations to talk to each other. They needed an international language of risk. The world was shrinking. In the late 19th century, the steam engine conquered the ocean. A journey that once took 2 months now took 2 weeks. This speed was a miracle for trade. But for the virus, it was a first-class ticket. Diseases that used to burn themselves out on long voyages now arrived fresh and deadly. The old 40-day quarantine at the Lazzaretto was too slow for modern capitalism. Merchants in London and New York were furious. "Time is money!" they shouted. "We cannot wait 40 days!" So, the nations of the world faced a new dilemma. They had to rewrite the rules of global travel. They had to agree on a standard system. This brings us to the birth of international law. In 1851, diplomats and doctors from 12 countries gathered in Paris. They wore stiff collars and spoke in French. This was the first international sanitary conference. Their goal was to standardize the rules. To standardize means to cause something to conform to a standard. We must standardize the quarantine period. Before this, every port had different rules. One port might burn your ship, another might just spray it with vinegar. It was chaos. The diplomats argued for months. The British wanted free trade, no quarantine. The Mediterranean nations wanted safety, strict quarantine. They failed to agree on much at first. But they established a crucial precedent. Disease is an international problem, not a local one. This led to the signing of conventions. A convention is an agreement between countries covering particular matters, especially one less formal than a treaty. The Geneva Convention rules on the treatment of prisoners. The International Sanitary Convention rules on plague and cholera. These conventions required nations to notify each other. To notify means to inform someone of something, typically in a formal or official manner. If cholera appeared in Calcutta, the British had to send a telegram to Paris. This was the beginning of the global early warning system. But while the diplomats were talking in Paris, the real drama was happening on the docks of New York Harbor. The year is 1892, Ellis Island. The golden door to America. Millions of immigrants are arriving from Europe. They are fleeing poverty, war, and persecution. But before they can enter the land of the free, they must pass through the Great Hall. They must face the medical inspection. This was not a doctor visiting your house. This was an industrial assembly line of health. Imagine the noise. Thousands of people speaking 20 different languages. The air is thick with anxiety. The immigrants clutch their bags. They walk in a single-file line. Doctors in blue uniforms stand at the top of the stairs. They watch the immigrants climb. They are looking for shortness of breath. They are looking for a limp. They are looking for signs of weakness. This is called screening. Screening is the evaluation or investigation of something as part of a methodical survey to assess suitability for a particular role or purpose. The airport security screening takes time. The medical screening for cancer. The doctors at Ellis Island developed the 6-second physical. They had to decide your fate in the blink of an eye. If they saw something suspicious, they used a piece of chalk. They marked a code on your coat. H for heart, L for lameness, E for eyes. The most feared letter was E. It stood for trachoma. a contagious eye disease that causes blindness. The doctors would flip your eyelid inside out with a button hook, a metal tool used for buttoning shoes. It was painful. It was terrifying. If you had trachoma, you were marked. You were pulled out of line. You were sent to the isolation ward. And then, the most terrible word in the immigrant's dictionary: deportation. Deportation is the action of deporting a foreigner from a country. To deport means to expel a foreigner from a country, typically on the grounds of illegal status or for having committed a crime. He faces deportation back to Italy. The steamship companies were forced to pay for the return ticket. This was a brilliant piece of regulation. A regulation is a rule or directive made and maintained by an authority. Because the companies had to pay, they started doing their own inspections before the ship left Europe. They didn't want to lose money. So the border moved. The American border actually started in Liverpool, Hamburg, and Naples. This is a concept called externalization of the border. Externalization is the action of externalizing, attributing something to a cause outside oneself. Here, it means pushing the border checks to a foreign country. The burden of proof shifted to the traveler. It was no longer the state's job to prove you were sick. It was your job to prove you were healthy. You needed a certificate. A certificate is an official document attesting a certain fact. A vaccination certificate. A birth certificate. By the early 20th century, the world was crisscrossed by telegraph cables and steamship routes. The bureaucracy of health was humming along. It seemed like humanity had finally tamed the risk. We had the microscope. We had the telegram. We had the medical inspector. We had the international convention. Science was winning. The sanitarians were celebrating. But nature has a way of humbling us. The systems we built were designed for the wars of the past, for cholera and plague. They were designed for bacteria we could see or trace to a water pump. They were not designed for a virus that mutated in the trenches of a world war. A virus that moved through the air, invisible, silent, and faster than any telegram. The year 1918 was approaching. The Spanish flu was about to test the modern world, and it would reveal that even with all our inspections, all our chalk marks, and all our conventions, we were still vulnerable. The system was about to face its greatest failure, and from that failure, a new global institution would rise. The world is at war. In the trenches of France, soldiers are dying from bullets and gas. But in the barracks, they are dying from something else. A fever, a cough, a sudden collapse. It travels on the troop ships. It disembarks in Boston, in Brest, in Bombay. This is the Spanish flu. But here is a piece of historical truth. It did not start in Spain. It likely started in the United States, or perhaps France, or China. Historians debate the origin. So, why do we call it Spanish? This teaches us a vital word in political English: censorship. Censorship is the suppression or prohibition of any parts of books, films, news, etc. that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security. In 1918, the warring nations, Britain, France, Germany, the USA, had strict censorship. They did not want to report that their soldiers were sick. It would hurt morale. It would make them look weak. But Spain was neutral. They had a free press. When the King of Spain got sick, the Spanish newspapers wrote about it. The rest of the world read the Spanish papers and said, "Look, there is a flu in Spain." So the virus was named after the only country honest enough to report it. This highlights the danger of suppression. Suppression is the action of suppressing something, such as an activity or publication. The suppression of the news made the pandemic worse. Because the news was suppressed, cities were not warned. They did not prepare. September 28, 1918, Philadelphia, USA. The Director of Public Health, Wilmer Cruson, is under pressure. The city wants to hold a massive parade to sell Liberty loans, war bonds. Doctors beg him to cancel it. They say the flu is already in the city. He faces a critical decision. Critical here means having a decisive or crucial importance in the success, failure, or existence of something. The timing of the decision was critical. Cruson decides the war effort is more important. He allows the parade. 200,000 people crowd the streets. They scream, they cheer, they breathe on each other. It is the deadliest parade in American history. Within 72 hours, all 31 hospitals in Philadelphia are full. Within a week, 2,600 people are dead. This event proved that the old methods of quarantine the sick were useless against a virus that spread before symptoms appeared. You couldn't just stop the ships. The ships were carrying soldiers to win the war. So governments had to try something new. They had to control the behavior of the healthy. They introduced non-pharmaceutical interventions. This is a modern technical term, but the English words are simple. Intervention is the action of interfering or stepping in to change a situation. The most famous intervention was the mask. In San Francisco, the city passed an ordinance. An ordinance is a piece of legislation enacted by a municipal authority. It is a local law. The mask ordinance requires face coverings in public. The slogan was, "Wear a mask and save your life." Suddenly, the police were not just arresting criminals. They were arresting people with bare faces. These people were called mask slackers. To be a slacker means to be a lazy person who avoids work or responsibility. If you were a mask slacker, you were in violation of the ordinance. A violation is the action of violating someone or something. In law, it is a breach of a rule. He was fined for a traffic violation. The police could issue a fine. As a noun, a fine is a sum of money exacted as a penalty by a court of law or other authority. He had to pay a $5 fine. This was a massive shift in the relationship between the citizen and the state. In the 14th century, the state controlled the city walls. In 1918, the state controlled your face. But did it work? The data tells a mixed story. Cities that implemented strict measures early, like St. Louis, saved thousands of lives. Cities that waited, like Philadelphia, suffered. Strict means demanding that rules concerning behavior are obeyed and observed. But the human spirit resists control. In San Francisco, an anti-mask league was formed. 2,000 people met to protest. They claimed the ordinance violated their civil liberties. This tension is eternal. It happens in every century. The government says safety. The people say freedom. By 1919, the flu had killed perhaps 50 million people worldwide, more than the Great War itself. It burned through the population, and then mysteriously. It faded. But it left the world changed. Nations realized that a virus does not respect borders. A passport cannot stop a microbe. The diplomats in Paris and London looked at the wreckage. They realized that the old system of notification, sending a telegram when you found a disease, was too slow. They needed a permanent, global brain. They needed an organization that didn't just meet once a year, but worked every single day. They needed to move from international cooperation, nations talking to nations, to supranational authority, an organization above nations. This is a sophisticated prefix, supra. It comes from Latin, meaning above or beyond. Supranational means having power or influence that transcends national boundaries or governments. The League of Nations was born in 1920, and inside it, they built the Health Organization. It was the grandfather of the World Health Organization, WHO. Its mission was to collect data, not just on plague and cholera, but on everything: nutrition, cancer, housing. They wanted to create a standard of health for the human race. But there was a problem. The League of Nations was weak. The United States refused to join. The organization had no army. It had no police. It only had the power of persuasion. Persuasion is the action of persuading someone, or of being persuaded to do or believe something. Could you persuade a virus to stop? No. Could you persuade a dictator to report an outbreak if you wanted to hide it? As the 1930s approached, the world was moving toward another war. And in the shadow of war, information becomes a weapon. The dream of a united global health system was about to be tested by the rise of fascism and the Iron Curtain. And then, a new invention would change travel forever. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a train. It was the airplane. Travel was about to get vertical, and the speed of risk was about to hit 500 miles per hour. The propeller spins. The engine roars. The year is 1947. A man boards a flight in Mexico City. He feels fine. He lands in New York City a few hours later. He takes a bus. He walks through the crowded streets of Manhattan. 2 days later, he is dead. Smallpox. This event terrified the American authorities. In the age of the ship, a sick man would have died at sea or shown symptoms before he arrived. In the age of the airplane, he could travel thousands of miles while the virus was still incubating. The buffer of time was gone. The ocean was no longer a wall. This crisis proved that the old international sanitary conventions were outdated. The world needed a new system that moved as fast as a plane. In 1948, out of the ashes of World War II, the United Nations created a new agency, the World Health Organization, WHO. Its headquarters were in Geneva, Switzerland. Its mission was bold: the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. But how do you achieve this when every country has different rules? The WHO had to solve the problem of standardization. To standardize means to make things of the same type have the same basic features. Imagine a traveler trying to enter Brazil. Brazil wants a certificate in Portuguese. The traveler has a certificate in German. The border guard cannot read it. The traveler is stuck. The WHO solved this with a simple yellow piece of paper: the International Certificate of Vaccination or Prophylaxis. Colloquially, it is known as the Yellow Card. This was a masterpiece of bureaucratic design. It was trilingual, English, French, and the local language. It had a standard format. It was recognized by every member state of the UN. If you had the yellow card, you could pass. If you did not, you were stopped. This brings us to two essential words in travel English: valid and invalid. Valid, adjective, means legally or officially acceptable. Your passport is valid for 5 years. This ticket is no longer valid. Invalid is the opposite. The certificate is invalid because it has no stamp. To make the yellow card valid, it needed a specific stamp from an approved center. It needed a signature. It needed a date. This system turned health into a requirement for entry. A requirement is a thing that is compulsory, a necessary condition. A visa is a requirement for entry. Vaccination is an entry requirement. In 1951, the WHO adopted the International Sanitary Regulations. For the first time, there was a global rulebook. It stated exactly which diseases required a certificate: cholera, plague, yellow fever, smallpox. It also limited what countries could do. A country could not just ban all travelers because of a rumor. They had to base their decisions on scientific evidence. Evidence is the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. There is no evidence of plague in that city. This created a tension between sovereignty and cooperation. Sovereignty is the authority of a state to govern itself or another state. The nation defended its sovereignty. Countries love their sovereignty. They do not like being told what to do by an agency in Geneva. If the WHO said, "You must let these travelers in," a country might say, "No, it is our sovereign right to close the border." This tension is the central conflict of modern global health. Who is in charge, the nation or the world? Despite these arguments, the system worked brilliantly for one specific goal: eradication. To eradicate means to destroy completely, put an end to. The root is from Latin radix, root. To pull up by the roots. The WHO launched a massive campaign to eradicate smallpox. They used the yellow card system to track immunity. They used surveillance and containment. Instead of vaccinating everyone, which is impossible, they searched for outbreaks. When they found a case, they rushed in, like a fire department, and vaccinated everyone in that specific village. They built a ring of immunity around the virus. In 1980, the WHO made a historic announcement. Smallpox was gone. It was the first time in history that humans had intentionally extinguished a disease from the face of the earth. It was a triumph of bureaucracy, inspections, and international cooperation. The sanitarians of the 19th century would have been proud. The searchers of the 17th century would have been amazed. Humanity had built a machine to kill death, but success made us complacent. Complacent means showing smug or uncritical satisfaction with oneself or one's achievements. We became complacent about the risks. As the 20th century ended, the lists of quarantinable diseases shrank. The yellow card was used less and less. We thought we had won. But nature is creative. While we were watching the old enemies, cholera, plague, new enemies were evolving in the jungle. Viruses that did not follow the old rules. Viruses that were not on the list. In 2003, A businessman checked into the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong. He was feeling unwell. He had a new kind of pneumonia. He walked down the hallway. He touched the elevator button. This single touch would trigger a global crisis that would shatter the confidence of the modern world. It was called SARS. And it would reveal that in a hyper-connected global economy, a yellow card for smallpox is useless against a mystery virus. The system was about to crash. The 9th floor of the Metropole Hotel, Hong Kong, February 21st, 2003. A doctor from Guangzhou checks into room 911. He is sick, but he doesn't know how sick. He walks into the hallway. He sneezes. He touches the elevator button. In the history of risk, this is a defining moment. 7 strangers on that floor breathe the same air. They touch the same buttons. One flies to Toronto. One flies to Singapore. One flies to Hanoi. Within 24 hours, a local virus has become a global crisis. This is the superspreader event. A superspreader is an unusually contagious individual who infects a disproportionately large number of others. The SARS crisis of 2003 shattered the illusion of safety. The old yellow card system was designed for known enemies like smallpox. It was a list. If the disease wasn't on the list, the system ignored it. SARS was not on the list. It was a mystery. It moved faster than the official reports. By the time governments sent a telegram, the virus was already in the next country. This exposed a fatal flaw in the system: the lack of transparency. Transparency is the quality of being open and honest. It means not hiding information. The government must operate with transparency. There was a lack of transparency regarding the data. In the early days of SARS, information was delayed. Rumors spread faster than facts. This caused panic. The global economy froze. Airlines went bankrupt. Hotels in Hong Kong were empty. It proved that in the modern world, health is not just a medical issue. It is an economic issue. To fix this, the world had to rewrite the constitution of global health. In 2005, the 194 member states of the World Health Organization agreed to a radical new set of rules: the International Health Regulations, IHR. This is the legal framework that governs the world today. It changed the definition of a threat. Instead of a specific list of diseases, the new rules required countries to report any event that might be a public health emergency of international concern. This is a mouthful, so they call it a PHEIC, pronounced fake or FIKE. It stands for Public Health Emergency of International Concern. If a country finds a strange new virus, they have a legal obligation to notify the WHO within 24 hours. An obligation is an act or course of action to which a person is morally or legally bound, a duty or commitment. They have a treaty obligation to report the outbreak. This shifted the power dynamic. It gave the WHO the authority to ask questions, even if a country wanted to stay silent. It gave them the power to issue travel advisories. An advisory is an official announcement that contains advice or a warning. The State Department issued a travel advisory. In 2003, the WHO issued an advisory against traveling to Toronto. The city was furious. They said it was safe, but the advisory stayed. The tourists vanished. Toronto lost billions of dollars. This taught every city on Earth a lesson. If you cannot manage the risk, you will lose the economy. So, how do you manage risk in the age of the jet engine? You turn to technology. Walk into any modern international airport today. Look at the ceiling. Look at the cameras. They are not just looking for weapons. They are looking for heat. The thermal scanner is the modern equivalent of the searcher of the dead. But instead of an old woman touching your body, a machine reads your infrared radiation from 30 feet away. This is non-intrusive inspection. Non-intrusive means not disrupting or interfering, done without physical contact. The security check was non-intrusive. The goal is to filter the crowd without stopping the flow of money. We want safety, but we do not want to wait 40 days in a harbor. We want frictionless security. But does it work? Critics argue that thermal scanners are security theater. They make us feel safe, but they miss many cases. A person can take a pill to lower their fever. A person can be infectious before they are hot. This brings us back to the eternal problem: detection. How do you find a needle in a haystack when the haystack is moving at 500 miles per hour? As the 2000s progressed, we saw new threats: MERS, Ebola, Zika. Each time, the system was tested. For Ebola, we used screening at airports. We asked passengers, "Have you been to West Africa?" For Zika, we sprayed airplanes to kill mosquitoes. We built a massive, invisible wall of data. We tracked passengers. We shared intelligence. We thought we were ready for the big one. We had the IHR, the laws. We had the WHO, the command center. We had the thermal scanners, the eyes. We had the laboratories, the brain. But in late 2019, in a city in central China, a new signal appeared. It was faint at first, a cluster of pneumonia cases. The system was about to face its ultimate exam. The question was not whether we had the tools to stop it. We had the best tools in history. The question was whether we had the political will to use them. And more importantly, could a system built on national sovereignty survive a threat that ignored all nations? The final chapter of our story is not just history. It is the reality you lived through. It is the story of how the entire world learned the vocabulary of epidemiology. Words like lockdown, social distancing, and quarantine moved from the history books to the dinner table. And it leads us to the final question. What is the future of the city? Will we build higher walls, or will we build better sensors? December 2019. A digital signal flashes on a server. An AI algorithm called Blue Dot, based in Toronto, notices a cluster of unusual pneumonia reports in Wuhan, China. It sends an alert to its clients. It beats the World Health Organization by 9 days. This is the speed of modern risk management. We no longer rely on a ship captain or a town crier. We rely on artificial intelligence scraping the internet for keywords, but algorithms cannot stop planes. In early 2020, the world witnessed the ultimate test of every system we have discussed in this series. The searchers, the quarantines, the inspections, and the travel bans. They were all deployed at once, and for a moment, they all failed. The virus moved too fast. It jumped from a market to an airport to a cruise ship. It ignored the thermal scanners. It ignored the borders. And so, governments reached for the oldest tool in the box, the tool from the Middle Ages, the tool from Ragusa and Venice. They ordered a lockdown. This word is now common, but its origin is terrifying. In prison terminology, a lockdown is the confinement of prisoners to their cells for a temporary period as a security measure. In 2020, the entire world became a temporary prison. Cities like London, New York, and Paris fell silent. The hustle and bustle of trade stopped. The only sound was the siren of the ambulance. This was an unprecedented event. Unprecedented means never done or known before. The scale of the shutdown was unprecedented. But unlike the 14th century, we did not just sit in the dark. We moved our lives into the digital world. The inspection moved from the physical gate to the digital screen. We saw the rise of a new concept: biosecurity. Biosecurity refers to procedures or measures designed to protect the population against harmful biological or biochemical substances. The airport has tight biosecurity protocols. The Bill of Health, Part 3, and the Yellow Card, Part 8, merged into something new: the QR code. In many countries, your ability to enter a subway, a restaurant, or an office depended on a color code on your phone: green for safe, red for risk. This is the modern version of the searcher of the dead. But instead of an old woman looking for a black spot on your skin, a database looks for a digital spot in your history. Have you been near an infected person? Have you been vaccinated? This creates a new social contract. A social contract is an implicit agreement among the members of a society to cooperate for social benefits. We give up some privacy for the social contract of health. We trade our data for our freedom to move. The city of the future is not just a collection of buildings. It is a smart city that watches its own health. We are now seeing wastewater surveillance, robots testing the sewage to find viruses before people even feel sick. This is the legacy of Edwin Chadwick and the Sanitarians. Part 5. Updated with DNA sequencing. We are seeing touchless travel, biometric faces scans replacing the paper passport. This is the legacy of Ellis Island. Part 6. Updated with lasers. But amidst all this high-tech control, we must remember the human element. The city is resilient. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Toughness. The resilience of the human spirit. London burned in 1666. It survived. It faced the plague in 1665. It survived. It faced the cholera in 1854. It survived. Every time a city faces death, it learns. It builds a new institution. It writes a new rule. It invents a new word. We started this journey in the harbour of Messina in 1347, watching the rats scurrying down the ropes. We end it in a world of satellites and servers. The risk never disappears. It just changes shape. It evolves. And so must we. We have learned that compliance is not just about following rules. It is about protecting our neighbors. We have learned that transparency is the only way to stop a rumor. We have learned that we are all connected by the air we breathe and the water we drink. The history of the city is the history of managing the invisible. It is the story of how we agree to live together, crowded in narrow streets, without destroying each other. It is a fragile, beautiful, and dangerous experiment. And it continues. Every time you show your passport, every time you pass a health inspection, every time you see a safety first sign. You are participating in a ritual that is 700 years old. You are part of the system that keeps the lights on. Thank you for listening to the London Gritty Chronicles.